When we start looking at the issue of funerals and funeral liturgies and that kind of thing, I thought I would start with the Roman Missal and what the Roman Missal has to say about funeral masses. Because a lot of people don't really understand what is behind the ritual of the funeral mass. Among the masses for the dead, the funeral mass holds first place. It may be celebrated on any day except for solemnities that are holy days of obligations, Thursday of Holy Week, the Paschal Triduum, which would be from Holy Thursday to the Easter Vigil, and the Sundays of Advent, Lent, and Easter, with due regard also for other requirements for the norms of the law. So there are days set aside when we're not allowed to celebrate a funeral, okay? Because there's something else that is going on that takes precedence even over the dead. The other one is masses of intention for the dead. A mass for the dead, on receiving the news of a death for the final burial or first anniversary, may be celebrated even on days within the octave of the Nativity of the Lord, on days when an obligatory memorial occurs, and on weekdays other than Ash Wednesday or the weekdays of Holy Week. So during the weekday of Holy Week, we can't take a Mass intention for anybody who's dead. Why? Because our focal point is supposed to be on Jesus Christ and his suffering and death. So when we start looking at this, we begin to understand that the place of the death within the community always comes second to Christ. And that sometimes is confusing to people. Masses for the dead, the daily Mass for the dead, okay, may be celebrated on any weekdays in ordinary time on which optional memorials occur or when the office is for the weekday. During the weekdays, you can celebrate the memorial Mass for the dead or the ritual Mass for the dead or the office of the dead, okay? And we do that a lot here, okay? But you're never allowed to do it on Sunday. Weekdays only. Why? Sunday is the Sabbath. Sunday is a holy day of obligation. We're supposed to be in church. You know, skipping Mass on Sunday is still considered a mortal sin. So the Sunday Mass is set for the living, which would be all of us, for the people of God. The other thing is that in almost every Eucharistic prayer, there is an element where you pray for the deceased. But you pray for them in their entirety, not just singularly, that you would at a daily Mass where it's being offered for one person. So these are kind of guidelines that we have when it comes to understanding certain elements of praying for the dead and the funeral Mass itself. What is its priority? What is its structure? Where does it fit within the importance of the different Masses that can be celebrated? And the thing is, in here, it tells us it comes before an optional memorial. Anybody know what an optional memorial is? It's a Mass for a dead saint. So a dead person in the parish can actually come before the saint, right? And so in the Mass, you can use the name of the saint, but you can also pray that Mass for the deceased person. So the thing is, our own people come before the saints, which sometimes we forget also. So there is a priority. First is Jesus. Second is Jesus. Third is Jesus. Then is us. And then is the dead. And then the saints and all those other people thrown in. So there's a kind of a structure there. And it's understanding the structure and what is behind the structure. And this is where we have a tendency to go astray because we don't know the structure. The other thing is, if I'm going to celebrate the Mass for a deceased person, how many deceased people can I celebrate a Mass for at any given time? And it's supposed to be one. Now the thing is, if Mary and Joe Smith have both passed away, and the family has asked for a Mass for Mary and Joe Smith because they're both passed away and it's their parents, well, that's acceptable, okay? But if you come in and you want a Mass for Aunt Joe and Uncle Fred and my cousin Mary and, no, it's one Mass at a time. The thing we forget is that everybody who comes to church comes with an intention. And so the thing is, you can be remembering all of these dead relatives as you offer the Mass also. And you come and you pray for them as the priest prays the Mass. Because in the prayers of the faithful, he collects all the prayers of the faithful. And all those people that we want to pray for are included in the prayers of the faithful. So that's another thing that we need to understand when it comes to praying for the dead. Because frequently, it's like you just found out that somebody's died, and you want to go to church and you want to pray for them, but the Mass is already being offered for somebody else. Well, that's okay. Pray for that person yourself. Include them in your personal intentions. That's who you came to pray for. And the other people, they've got people to pray for also. So it's remembering that this is a more than thing. It's a both and an and. The other part is when we get into the funerals themselves, and this is always kind of the entertaining part. Can a Catholic and a non-Catholic be buried together? I've always found that one amusing because a lot of people, it's like you have people where it's like, no, the Protestants have to be buried in the Protestant side and the Catholics are supposed to be buried in the Catholic side. And the reality is the law of the church is very simple. If you're married to them and spent your life with them, you should be beside each other, just not in the same casket. There are some limitations, okay? Can we have a funeral for a non-Catholic? And the answer to that is yes, of course. A non-Catholic married to a Catholic may, and this is may, have a Catholic funeral as long as it is in keeping with their wishes. It has to be part of their wish. They've been married, they've been coming to the Catholic Church for years, and this is what they would like. And it would not be offensive to their family, because you have to take in the needs of the living. Generally, this is done when they have been an active member of the Catholic community and are seen as members of the parish life, right? But I've had it where it's like the person was active in the church, was active in the parish, but has been in the nursing home for 10 or 15 years, but it was always their wish to be buried out of the Catholic Church. And that's when it's really, really important to make sure that the family and friends know what your wishes are so that they're not guessing, because that's not healthy either. Who is eligible for a Catholic funeral? And this is one that's very, very interesting because there are 16,000 Catholics in this parish, but they don't all go to church. And some of them aren't even really nice people. But there's 16,000 Catholics in this parish, and every one of them, by their baptism, is entitled to full Christian burial. They're all entitled. They may not want it, but they are entitled to it by their baptism. And there are times when, as a priest, all of a sudden the family comes in and they want to have a funeral for so-and-so, and you don't know them, and nobody in the parish knows them, and you find out, yes, they live down the street and never went to church, never had any of their children sacramentalized, but they were a baptized Catholic. And so it is our duty and our responsibility to bury them with full Christian honors. Any baptized Catholic is entitled to a Catholic funeral regardless of whether they go to church or not, as long as they have never publicly declared that they are no longer Catholic. And most people don't even know how to do that. Most of them just go around being a sinner. But that's okay, because Jesus came for the sinners. And we refer to ourselves as a church of sinners. So they belong here. Now, the difficulty is it's really, really hard coming up with a homily for them, because for some reason people don't think we should speak ill of the dead. even if they've been misbehaving for their entire lives. Children whose baptism was intended by the parents, but who died before being baptized, these children are to receive the full rights of a baptized person. If it was the intention. One of the funerals I had to do for a baby, I was chatting with the couple a week and a half before the baby died at their baptismal prep course. And they were talking about, they're really, really looking forward to the baby, da-da-da-da-da-da. And 3 days later, she's having difficulty, and they lost the baby. And of course, then the question was, well, what do we do? Well, the thing is, Mom and Dad had every intention of baptizing that baby. They had been to the baptismal preparation course and everything. So we treat the baby as a baptized Christian, as a baptized Catholic. Members of the RCIA who are journeying towards the Catholic Church may also receive full funeral rites. Here again, it's kind of important that they've kind of told somebody. Because what happens if the person is journeying towards becoming a Catholic but hasn't told their family about it yet? It can create all kinds of interesting havoc. So there again, it's sort of like making sure people actually tell each other what their plans are. Because nobody knows the moment, the hour, when God is going to call us home. Are all funerals the same? The funeral mass is a ritual, and the priest is required to stick to the ritual. We have the Roman Missal that tells me what to do at a funeral. We have the vigil book, and it's all laid out in there, what exactly we are supposed to do at a funeral. And it doesn't allow for a lot of deviations. Why? Because the liturgy belongs to the entire church, not to the individual. And so there's a number of things that happen there. There are some deviations allowed. These would be for military personnel. For a police officer, members of Parliament, the Knights of Columbus, CWL. Each of these should be checked with a parish priest as to their practice, because some parishes have slightly different practices for things like the CWL or the Knights of Columbus. Military, police, parliamentary people, that's pretty much set and has been set for a long time. For an example, for a military funeral, taps can be played in the church or after the deceased is placed in the coach, or the other one they have, if the person is military, is usually there is a wreath with poppies somewhere in the sanctuary. Or it could be at the side of the casket, or when the casket is taken out, it's placed on the top of the casket and they put the poppies into the wreath, or they lay their poppies on top of the casket. Sometimes they also do that out at the gravesite service. And you have a number of different things that you can do. And sometimes the deciding factor in these things is what's the weather like. Because if it's pouring rain, we're probably going to do the poppy thing in the church. Because trying to do it out of the gravesite is not always the safest thing to do. Often what makes a funeral mass look different is the choice of the readings and the music. If you choose upbeat music, it generally will appear more like a celebration than if the music is very sad, which often results in no understanding of the celebration of one of God's children going home, the celebration of the resurrection. Most of you, I'm sure, can remember the funerals where the priest wore black, right? And then with Vatican II, we shifted over to white. And the shift was to move from the mourning to the celebration, because black was the sign of mourning. And the thing is, who are we mourning for? Ourselves. The mourning is all about us. But the Mass for the deceased person is about the resurrection. It's about the promise made to them in baptism. So what we had is we had the prayers of the Mass that all talked about the resurrection and the person being raised up and the person being before Jesus and all this kind of wonderful stuff, right? And we're mourning. And so there's something not quite right in it. And so the shift was to get us to focus more on the resurrection and where the person was, and sort of get us out of ourselves. But we still have to be understanding ourselves and the needs that we have as individuals. And this is where the three parts of the funeral liturgy come into play. Because the funeral liturgy is made up of three very distinct parts. The first part is the vigil service. Now, how many of you remember the good old days when the vigil service was you came to the church, prayed the rosary, and went home? Right? How meaningful was that? You know, in some ways it could be very, very meaningful, right? But in some ways it was sort of like, it was kind of sterile, right? Anybody here Irish? Do you know what the Irish would do? They'd lay the person out on the table. They would drink whiskey and tell stories about him all night long. You know? And the thing is, it was a joyful celebration. The SOB is finally gone, you know? And so there was trying to pull these things together and sort of realize that there's a number of different things at work here. And so the thing is, like, you still find from certain cultures, you'll have the vigil service, you'll have the readings, you'll have the music, you'll have all of that, but then they want to pray the rosary at the end because that's meaningful and powerful for them. And that should always be honored and respected. But we also need to understand the role of the vigil service in the entire funeral liturgy. The vigil service is about the person. The vigil service is where we start the process of remembering who the person was in the lives of the people. And that's why the proper place for a eulogy or a tribute is at the vigil. And we draw that from the Irish people, right? Where the thing is, you would walk over by the table, you would take your ounce of whiskey, you would throw it back, and then you would tell tales about the person, right? And you would tell a story. And everybody would be there listening to the story, and they would add to the story, and they would add to the story, and the stories would go on all night long. And the stories, you know, the best part about the Irish was they didn't care if the story was good or bad. It was the story. You had to tell the story. Remember when Mick went and did XYZ, you know, when he stole the parson's horse, you know, it was part of the story of the person's life, and it was all laid out there. Next day, we go to the church and we shift with a funeral mass, the Mass of the Resurrection, about Jesus Christ and the promise made to us in baptism. And so we celebrate. And this is where Vatican II came in and said, we're missing the boat here. We've gotten more and more and more and more mournful because it's all about us, and we're feeling bad. And some of you might remember, you might not remember, but there was that time when the cemetery was very, very close to the church, and you walked the casket over, you walked the person over, and there was this sort of like long, drawn-out walk that you did, you know, and it was like just so mournful, so sad, right? And the thing is, in a certain way, it's not a bad idea because we really don't want to rush them to the grave, you know? But at the same time, it's kind of like, who are we really focused on here? Us or them? And so the Mass is supposed to be about them and Jesus Christ. The next part of it is the interment. And the interment then goes back to the person again and focuses on the person and the mourning. But it's also closure. It's that chance to say goodbye. And it's always interesting how people say goodbye. One of the things I find really, really interesting is when the cemetery was right next to the church, you'd walk the person over, you put them in the ground, and very quickly you came back to the church so that you could start the reception. And then you talked and you partied, and you talked to people that you might not have seen for a long time because they're there for the funeral. And this was kind of, you know, the deceased has brought us all together. When I celebrated my aunt's funeral, we had my aunt to the back of the church, and she's there, and she looked pretty good, you know. And I'm standing there, and I'm looking at her, and all of a sudden I have this very, very strange thought running through my head. Because ever since I'd been there, like I'd gotten there about an hour before, and it took me forever to get to see my aunt because there's all the cousins and all the relatives and the aunts and the uncles, and they're all there, and it's, oh, good to see you, haven't seen you, for 2 years, last funeral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, I get to my aunt, and I'm standing there, I'm looking at my aunt, and my cousin comes up to me, and he puts his arm around me, and then he stops, he looks at me, he says, "Why are you chuckling?" And I says, "I just had this really, really strange thought because I'm looking at Aunt Helen and I can hear Aunt Helen saying, 'If I'd known they would have all got together, I would have done this earlier.'" He, of course, informed me what he would do to me if I put that in the homily. But it was interesting because the funeral brings everybody together, and everybody's got to talk and everybody's got to share. My Uncle Louis had this really, really entertaining habit at every funeral. And all of us wanted to sit beside Uncle Louis because Uncle Louis, the first thing he would do is he would whip out pictures of the grandchildren. And he had to show you the pictures of the grandchildren and what they've been up to, right? So we all wanted to sit beside Uncle Louis because we're talking about the living, right? When my Uncle Louis passed away, there we were, this whole row of us, passing pictures back and forth, right? And of course, my aunt and my cousin come walking in, and as they went by us, my cousin looks at us, and oh, she was not a happy camper, right? And my aunt looked at us, and she gets this huge grin on her face, right? Well, after the funeral mass and the interment, we meet for the reception, and my aunt comes flying over and goes, "Let me see those pictures, let me see those pictures," right? And my cousin is mad, and we all assumed that she was mad because she had to sit at the front and couldn't see the pictures. She was mad that we were sharing pictures during her dad's funeral. And we're going, but that's what Uncle Louis always did. And we thought it would be the great way to honor Uncle Louis, is to bring our pictures and share the stories. Because that's what Uncle Louis did. And so all families and different cultures have traditions that they weave into the funeral services to help us move through them. But they play a very, very important part because they shift us from the person to Jesus, to the person, to closure. They move us through the steps of grieving. And we kind of have to do that. I had a funeral in Calgary in which a young woman had passed away. And on the day of the funeral, their kids, because they had 3 young kids, there's like 60, 70 kids in the church. Their friends from school walked over to the church for the funeral. Well, the dad shows up, no kids. And he comes in and he looks in the church and he's like, "Father, what are all these kids doing here?" And I was, "Well, they're here to support their friends. Where are your children?" And he's like, "Well, my aunt said it'd be a bad idea to bring the kids to the funeral mass, so we left them with my aunt." And I said, "I don't think that's a good idea because all these kids are going to be at the kids' mom's funeral, and they're not." And I said, "There's no way I'm going to go in there and send the kids back home." So Dad's like, "Okay, can I run home and get the kids? Can you delay the funeral for a few minutes?" And so off he went, and he picked up the 3 kids, and the aunt was livid. The kids should not see this, the kids should not. Well, the thing is, it's like, I'm sorry, it's their mother. They need to be there because how are they going to put some understanding and sense of closure on it? The other side of it is they need the support of their friends. And when those kids walked into the church and they saw all their friends there to support them, that was an incredible feeling. The other part of it that was really, really interesting is because after the funeral service, right, do you know what it's like when you've got 60 or 70 small children in a hall? It's just nuts. And of course the kids are running around and the kids are loud and kids are all noisy and that kind of stuff, right? And it's a funeral reception. And do you know how many of the older people were walking around going, could we get those kids to be quiet? Could we get those kids to settle down? No, the kids are teaching us something. Life goes on. And every now and then I'd find one of the three children sitting in a corner very, very quietly. And you go and you talk to them for a little bit because they're sad. Their mom has passed away. But their sadness would be very, very short. It'd be a couple of minutes and then they're off with their friends again because life goes on. And they kind of have to understand that. Yes, you're going to have sad moments and you're going to have joyful moments. And you're going to have sad moments and you're going to have joyful moments. And that's part of living. That's part of life. So when we look at the funeral mass and the liturgies around it, we have to understand that this is trying to help us work through the stages of grieving. Help us come in contact with, how do I deal with this stuff? How should I deal with this stuff? When we look at the funeral liturgy, the vigil service has the most flexibility to it. It's not a mass. And so you can do different things with it. And you can use different kind of music. And you can use a eulogy and you can put a tribute in there. The downside of it, though, is one of the problems that we're starting to have in our society today is that the vigil is going longer than the mass. Because Uncle Joe needs to say something, and Uncle Frank needs to say something, and Mary needs to say something, and Betty needs to say something. And all of a sudden, the tributes go longer and longer and longer and longer and longer, and we forget what that does emotionally to the people. Because all of those tributes take people on a roller coaster ride, right? Because there's laughter and there's crying, and there's laughter and there's crying. And you can only subject people to the roller coaster ride of emotions for so long. And then it becomes somewhat abusive. Because they can't take it anymore. It's sort of like they're in overload, right? And so one of the things to remember is if you're part of a funeral planning, or even for your own, I just want Uncle Fred, if he's still alive, to give the tribute. Keep it short. Like a 7-minute tribute is very nice. Put some silence in there so that people get to think about what was just said. The other side of it is if you're going to give the tribute or you're going to give the eulogy, write it out. Because what happens is when you're up there and you're giving a eulogy, you're taking the people on a ride. But the problem with it is their brains are going to connect to the ride. So they might remember part of the story, or they might even know the whole story, and all of a sudden they're off remembering. And then they miss the rest of your eulogy, or they miss part of the eulogy. Well, if you haven't written it out, then how do they follow you? So somebody comes up to you afterwards and says, geez, that was really, really good. I liked what you had to say, but I missed part of it. Oh, not a problem. Here, I have a copy. The other side of it is you give the copy to the family members. If it's a husband who has passed away, you give it to his wife and the children. The wife has passed away, you give it to the husband and the children. They put it in their Bible. And when they're having one of those days where they're kind of sad and when they're kind of depressed or something, they take that out, they read it, and hopefully it lifts them up. It makes them remember. And that's a healthy, healthy thing. You can't just take death and stick it behind you. It's behind you, yes, but it has to be honored and respected. It is a part of who we are. We can't just close our doors to it. We have to be open and understanding of it. The Mass itself, one of the things is, it says that in the homily, the priest is not supposed to overemphasize the person. But at the same time, it is the priest's responsibility to tie the life of the person into the gospel. Somehow or another, he has to make some kind of connection between the gospel and the person, between the life of Jesus Christ and the person. You see, one of my favorite things is when you're doing a funeral for somebody who went to church regularly, was a very active member of the church, that's easy. When the person didn't go to church very often and the person wasn't active in the church, then you're scrambling to find some nuggets of truth. The other side of it is like when I first came to this parish, and you have a lot of funerals, and the thing is, I'm not even here a week, and I've already done 3 funerals. It's like, I don't know the person, so how do I tie them into the gospel? Well, the neat thing about it is, we have all of these readings, right? And there's Old Testament readings, New Testament readings, there's gospel readings, right? And you get the family to pick the readings out. And sometimes you can help. If they can tell you little stories about the person, you can kind of help them find a reading. But what it does is it gives you thematics, themes to work from. Because in the life of Jesus Christ, there's certain things that stand out. We talk about the heavenly banquet. We talk about the virtuous man, right? Well, the thing is, if we're talking about the virtuous man, one of the things that we can think about is the repentant thief on the cross. His virtue came at the end. He was a thief, he was a criminal, but he repented. And the virtue was there, even if it only came at the last moment. We talk about the heavenly banquet and the fact that Jesus provides the heavenly banquet. Well, if the person was somebody who went to church regularly and received the Eucharist, then you have some beautiful, beautiful readings that tie into that. You have somebody that is kind of a little bit different, right? And they're kind of scattered, and they've been all over the place, and they've kind of struggled with their faith and that kind of thing. Well, then you look at the reading from, there are many rooms in my Father's house. If there were not, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And understanding that there is a place prepared for all of us. You know, even those people who supported the Calgary Stampeders, there is a place for them in heaven. You know, it'll have a green Rough Rider flag over top of it, but there's a place for them in heaven. So it's understanding that the readings help us tie these things together because they give us themes to work from so that you can try and knit the life of the person into the life of Jesus Christ and make sense of it. Because all of us, by our baptism, are called to be imitators of Jesus Christ. But do we recognize the imitation of Jesus Christ in the life of the other? We don't even recognize it in ourselves some days. Sometimes it's much easier to see it in the life of the other before we see it in our own life. The interment is one that is kind of a little strange, and it takes all kinds of different directions nowadays. The interment is short. The closure is short. It's goodbye, right? And the thing is, you know, it's like the scriptures. You know, once you set the plow in motion, you don't look back. Well, the thing is, the plow that you put in motion is you lay the person to rest, and then you have to move forward. The longer you dwell, the harder it is to move forward. But one of the things that happens is around the gravesite is the people don't know how to say goodbye anymore. And so all of a sudden, we've concocted some really, really entertaining activities around the gravesite to sort of say goodbye. You take a flower off of the casket spray, and then you throw them back into the grave. Well, they were going to go there anyway, so, right? Or you take what I like is when you take a flower off the casket spray and you take it home and you dry it and you might frame it. That one makes more sense to me. But the thing is, what people have done is they've tried to create some things to say goodbye. And what it tells us is that there is a need. There is a need for saying goodbye, but we haven't quite figured this one out yet. And so in our society today, this is kind of where we're at, because we don't know how to say goodbye anymore. It's like, how many of you, when you leave the house, say goodbye, and how many of you say, I'll see you later? When your children come to visit you, right, at Christmas time or something like that, do you say goodbye, or do you say, when I see you again, or see you later? More often than not, it's see you later, because we don't have a sense of the goodbye. Right? And so it's created some entertaining issues and brought about some entertaining things that we have to deal with when it comes to funerals. Each part of this plays an important role. At the funeral, at the vigil service, frequently the casket will be open. It's about the person, right? Many times nowadays, people are asking that it be a closed casket because they don't want people remembering them laying in the casket. Now, if you have any Filipino friends, they're kind of entertaining because they all pose with the deceased, which is kind of weird, and the first couple times you run into it, it's kind of odd. But the thing is, it's part of their culture, part of their tradition. And so they'll all stand there by the casket, looking, smiling, and people take pictures of them. Okay, it's not from my culture, but we have to be respectful of it because it's part of the need to put closure on things for them. When the funeral mass happens, one of the things that people don't quite understand is the placing of the pall, the white garment that goes over top of the casket. Even for a military funeral, even for a parliamentary funeral, all of that other stuff comes off, the white pall goes on. Because when we stand before the power of God, God does not care what we did for our living. God does not care who we were in this world. God cares that we are one of his children called home. So he doesn't care about our money. He doesn't care about our prestige. He doesn't care about our power. None of that stuff is important to Jesus. What's important is that we are his brothers and sisters. What is important is that we are God's children. And so the casket is covered. And the thing is, I was actually in a parish where I found this really, really amusing. They had different palls for different people. The wealthy people got nicer palls than the poor people. I was appalled. I got in trouble because I hid the... Well, the thing is, they had 3 palls, and then for some reason, 2 of the 3 palls disappeared, never to be found again. And so they had to use the same one all the time. The only exception for that is if you have a pall for children and a pall for infants, because of the size of the casket. And that's the only difference that should be allowed. But even then, the symbolism on the palls should be the same, so that it's the commonality, that it doesn't change, right? Because they're all God's children, and they're all called home. And so there's that commonality. Incense is used in the funeral rites, and I was talking with Mary beforehand. When we have the ashes, when the person has already been cremated, we don't use incense at the funeral mass for them, right? Because they're already ash. When the deceased is here, we incense the body because the body is sacred. It's God's creation. When it's ash, it's already turned back to the dust from which it came. Different theologies. Trying to understand the importance of the body. In the Catholic Church, since Vatican II, cremation has come back into play. And for a number of different reasons. One, we're running out of graveside space, right? Caskets take up a lot of space. Full body burial takes up a lot of space. You can do a crematorium, you can put the person in the ground, it takes up a lot less space. And the thing is, in some of our major cities around the world, this is a big problem. Where do you bury the dead, right? And so, because we respect the body, even in the form of ash, we want to put it someplace where we can go, honor it, respect it, visit, okay? But when you're running out of place to bury them, cremation comes into play. We are allowed to use cremation unless it's an action to deny the resurrection, which is where we stopped cremating many, many years ago. Cremation used to be part of the Catholic Church from the beginning. Burning the dead was perfectly acceptable. But in the Middle Ages, cremation was seen to be a denial of the resurrection, because the whole idea was that you've burnt the body, therefore there's no body to be returned to the heavenly form. The flip side of it is, if God wants to take a bunch of ash, turn it back into the person's body, he can do it. We can't put limitations on God. So the sense of cremation has changed. And it's acceptable. What the church encourages is that at the funeral mass, the body should be there and the cremation done afterwards. That's the order that we would like to see it done. And then you do the interment at a later date, right? Because we send the deceased away, the cremation takes place, the family and the person and the priest gather, and we lay them to rest. That's the general way we'd like to do it. It doesn't always work that way, and for a multitude of reasons. The one that I find that is problematic that comes into play is money. Frequently, it's a cost factor. Because if you have the person cremated right away, it costs X number of dollars, and you don't have all these other expenses that are allied in there. Which sometimes remind us that we should have funeral insurance. We should be planning ahead. Or you could be like my father, who intends to spend everything and leave us with the cost of the funeral. But, the challenge, though, is to plan ahead, right? And if you've got it laid out, then people know what to do, right? If you've planned ahead, then there should be money there to take care of things. But we don't always want to plan ahead, because as soon as we start planning ahead, it makes other people uncomfortable. I remember when my mom and dad sent out their last will and testament, their end-of-life directives, and what they wanted for their funeral. And all of a sudden you're looking at this going, what the heck are they up to? Like, what do they know that they're not sharing? Is there something that they are not telling us, right? Well, my parents did this over 20 years ago, And the thing is, they've sent a couple updates since then, because, they're living longer than they thought they were going to live, and they're changing their mind. So my mother still wants to be carried out of the church to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. If that's what Mom wants to go out of the church to, then fine by me, The thing is, it's like planning ahead and letting people know. My dad's music for his funeral is going to be very solemn, right? Fine. My mom's funeral, we will sing Morning Has Broken, right? With an upbeat tune, right? And they will be joyful, because their instructions say, and you will be joyful singing it, And my mom wants really, really upbeat music, because for her, it's sort of like, I don't know why you guys are crying. I'm with Jesus. It's all good, right? My father wants us all to feel really, really bad that he's left, So, they've planned their funeral in accord, And the thing is, it's like part of it is understanding where they're coming from, and letting it be, So my father wants a little more solemn situation. Fine. My mother wants it more upbeat. That's fine. But we all, as a family, know what their desires and wishes are. They pick their readings. My brother and I already know what we're supposed to be preaching on. The only question is, which one of us is going to be able to do the preaching? And that probably will come down to a last-minute discussion of which one of us thinks that we can get up there and deliver the homily without falling apart. Now, on the other hand, my mother keeps saying that she figures that by the time she dies, the bishop will be the one doing her funeral. Which means neither David nor I get to preach. So that'd be fine. So when we look at these things, there's things that come into play. But the big thing is, what are your wishes? Most of you have been to many, many, many funerals. What is it you want your funeral to look like? And so that should be thinking ahead, letting your family know that there is a plan. And there's nothing wrong with letting your family know. Yes, sometimes it makes them a little distressed. But the other side of it is do you know how distressed family members are when all of a sudden somebody dies and then they're facing all of this stuff? And you're sitting there and you're trying to pick readings, and it's like, well, Mom had some favorite readings, but I don't remember, and they're stressing. And the thing is, That's not necessarily helpful, is having your family stressing out. There should be a sense of peace, a sense of tranquility to deal with all of this stuff. The other factor is many of us have family members who don't go to church. And the thing is, what do you do when you're meeting with the family and none of the kids go to church? So all of a sudden it's like, geez, Father, could we, there's that really, really cool song from the, on the Disney Channel. Right? Or, what's another one that always gets thrown in there? It's a country and western thing from years ago. The church in the church in the Vale. Come to the church in the Vale. Well, it's a lovely old hymn, okay, but is it appropriate? It might be, it might not be. One of the key things is when you come to the church and you get a package of the readings, you also get a package with the hymns. Because there's nothing more entertaining when, Father, we were really, really wondering if the choir could sing Jehovah. And it's like, cool, I really, really like that hymn. Ain't going to happen. Because I don't think the Resurrection Choir could actually sing anything that fast. And the thing is, I'm sorry, but in most parishes have a Resurrection Choir or a funeral choir, or they call themselves different names. But most of them, okay, how many of you know what Jehovah is? Okay, it's a very contemporary, upbeat, with guitars and drums. How many of you have been to a funeral in the last 20 years that was done by a Resurrection Choir, whether it was here or somewhere else, could see guitars and drums? Ain't gonna happen, So the thing is, you have to think, what can the choir do? You also have to take into consideration, what is the choir capable and able to sing and sing well? Because that's the other side of it, is the choir may go, okay, we'll give it a shot. Mary really liked this one, we'll give it a shot. And it doesn't come off well. So there has to be a flexibility in there. But it also, my mom has told the choir back home, she's going out to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and they all have to learn how to sing it. And they all know how to sing it, because my mom's been telling them that for years. And so at least once a year, they sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic in my home parish. Don't know why, but they do. So the challenge is pulling this all together. But the big thing is plan ahead. Plan ahead. Help your family out. It's like all of a sudden, when somebody dies, there's great trauma. And people don't think well. But if everything is laid out for them, it makes life so much simpler and so much easier. And then what actually happens is they feel really, really good about the fact that they did what mom or dad wanted, or what Uncle Fred wanted, or what my sister wanted, or because it's right there in a book, in a program. This is what we would like. Some people I've seen have even gone so far as to say, so-and-so is going to do the first reading, so-and-so is going to do the second reading, if they're still alive. Because sometimes it's like you outlive the people that you're wanting to be part of your funeral service. The other thing that happens is people go, well, I don't want a service. Well, in the Catholic Church, that's not appropriate. Every Catholic is entitled to full Christian burial rites. To deny that of yourself is you're not harming yourself, you're harming all the other people. Some of you may think this is a little tacky, but it's kind of, where I come from and where I grew up. How many of you were raised on one of the reasons you go to the funeral service or to the vigil service is so that you can poke the dead to make sure they're gone? See, some of us come from a different place. And the thing is, part of it is to know, to make concrete. When you have no funeral service, there is no closure, there is no goodbye, there is no celebration, right? When somebody says, I don't want a funeral service, who are they harming? Everybody else. It's all about them. I don't want a funeral service. Well, guess what? The funeral service, as much as it is for the dead, it's for the living. It's to help the living deal with closure, saying goodbye, celebrating. It has elements in there. When I read the obituaries and I read, at the request of the deceased, no service will be held, I'm going, who helped this person? I had one lady, when we were talking to her because she was 96 and getting close to death, and I suggested, since none of her children went to church, we might want to plan ahead. And we talked about it a little bit, and she thought it was a good idea. So we picked out all of her music, and we picked out her readings, and we laid it all out, right? And then we sent copies to her children. The one daughter's comment to me was, but Father, nobody's going to be there. You know, my husband's dead. I only have one child. My other two sisters have no children. It's like, hello, there's not going to be anybody in the church. And I'm like, yeah, but we'll be there. The choir said they're going to come. It'll be fine. So we had the three daughters, the one grandchild, and 75 other people. Because she had friends. There was a dozen people from the nursing home that showed up. There were people who knew her. There was also people who knew the daughters. And they came to support them. And you should have seen the look on their faces where, I can't believe you people came. I can't believe you people came. Well, you know what? We do know how to respect each other. We do know how to be helpful to each other. We do know how to support each other. And that's part of what the funeral allows us to do, is to offer our condolences, to offer our heartfelt thoughts, to be there for each other. But when you take the service out and say, and no service, none of that is allowed to happen. And you harm those people. The same thing is like, you'll have the people say, well, but Father, none of my family goes to church anymore. You know, it's going to be uncomfortable in the church, you know. So let it be uncomfortable. This might be the last prophetic word you get towards your children. Make them come to church. You know, you made them come to church when they were younger, do it again when you die. You know, it's all good. You know, or, you know, I don't have a lot of Catholic friends. One of the things that really, really struck me was when I did a funeral service for a gentleman, and his comment was, you know, all of my children married Protestants, and none of them go to the Catholic Church anymore, and most of my friends are Protestants, and, you know, let's just have a service at the funeral home. Okay, well, if that's, you know, if that's what you want, I don't have to agree with it, but I have to respect it. So we had the service at the funeral home. Do you know who was most offended? The Protestant members, because we didn't do the Catholic thing. His friends knew he was a Catholic. And when they found out that the reason that he didn't have a Catholic funeral mass was because he thought he would offend them, they were very offended. Because you're Catholic, you do that Catholic thing. You know that wafer thing that you Catholics do, you know, that we're not part of. Well, you do it, you know. And they were upset because, you know, be true to who you are. And the thing is, most people will respect that. So oftentimes when it comes to, you know, planning what you're doing, it's like, let people know. But also be true to who you are. These things play a very, very important part in the life of people. And so we have to celebrate them and celebrate them well. One of the things that happens when we have a cremation is, what do you do with the ashes? As Catholics, we do not spread ashes. we put them somewhere. Why do we put them somewhere? Because somebody might want to go back and visit. Because it's the physical reminder of the person. When I worked at Foothills Hospital as a chaplain there, we had a gentleman come in through emergency and pass away. The family had no religious affiliation at all, but they wanted something. So we did a funeral service for them. And because I was the one who was on call and I was the one that took care of them and I was the one when the person died, I got to be the one. And so we made up a funeral service for them. And basically this is when being Catholic comes in really, really handy because you got a book. So I sat down with them and said, I'm Catholic. Would any of this work? And we put together, a couple readings, we had some music and that kind of thing. But they had the person cremated. And of course, the family decided that they would go out to a place outside of Calgary, because I can't tell you where the place is, because it's against the law to spread ashes in that place, and that's where they went. So they go out to it, and they drive out there. And they're driving around, and they stop by this beautiful tree, and they spread his ashes. And that's fine and dandy. A year later, I get a phone call from the daughter who is very, very distressed. Because on the anniversary of her father's death, her mom asked her to take her out to that spot. And they went out to the spot. And they drove around and around and around and around. And finally she stopped at a tree and said, "Here we are, Mom." And Mom got out and she cried a little bit and she sat and she chatted and she laid some flowers there. And they got back into the car and they drove back towards Calgary. And as they're driving back towards Calgary, the mom says to her daughter, "Now just remember, when I die, I want my ashes spread exactly there." The daughter's comment to me was, "Father, I got out there and I couldn't find the spot where we scattered Dad's ashes. And now Mom wants me to scatter her ashes with Dad's ashes, and all I can do is say, it's in that place." Why do we have places to bury the dead? Because we need them. Because every now and then you need to deal with the closure. One of my favorite places to go walking is in a cemetery. It's very quiet, it's very peaceful. None of the people there are bickering and arguing anymore. Right? They're all at peace, right? And the thing is, you look and you read the tombstones and you read the epitaphs, and it's like, you know what? There's a beauty in it. There's a beauty in it. These are the people who have gone before us marked with the sign of faith. These are the holy souls. And they should be honored and respected. One of the things that happens with the ashes, though, is how soon after the funeral do you have to inter them? And I've seen it a number of times where the one spouse goes, "Well, I'm just going to keep them until I die, and then the two of us can be buried together." Well, let me refer back to the beginning. If you married them and spent your life with them, you should be beside them, just not in the same casket. There's nothing wrong with them waiting for you in a niche in the wall or a mausoleum. Having ashes in the house is not forbidden, it's just highly discouraged. Because how do you explain it? The other part of it is how do you put closure on that part of your life? Fred's on the mantle, right? Okay? And the thing is, he's always on the mantle. Oh, Grandpa's up there. Look, there's Grandpa. He's in the box. It has some things that just don't quite work. And for some people, it's okay. But for a lot of people, it's kind of weird. And the thing is, you know what? A niche at the mausoleum is kind of nice. Put them in a columbarium. And when your turn comes, yeah. And the thing is, you can get some really, really cool urns that sort of match together and you look like you're connected for the rest of your lives and that kind of thing. The only trouble is as we know from reading the scriptures, that in heaven there is no marriage. So when you get there, Fred's already running around. Might have to edit that one out. So we don't encourage keeping the ashes in the house, but I have seen it where it was an infant who died and the ashes were in the house until the next family member died. And then those ashes of the child were buried with a grandparent or an uncle or aunt, because it's kind of hard to let children go. It's very different than letting an adult go. And so sometimes we have to take this into consideration. The other thing is, funeral homes often have places where they can keep the ashes for you until you're ready to do something with them. Yes, there is a time limit. There's usually a time limit of a year, but there are times when you can make arrangements and you pay a fee for storage. So there is ways to deal with it. The other thing is, and this is part of the thing where I feel like I'm sort of selling something. Make sure you have a will. Like, if you want to really, really mess with your children's life, don't have a will. But the reality is, everybody needs a will. Some of you may choose to have, funeral insurance. It's not a bad thing to have, okay? Because when you die, somebody's got to take care of all these things. The other one is pre-planning. How many of you have end-of-life directives? And all of you should have immediately put your hands up, because you should. Like, when you start coming towards the end of your life, does anybody know what they're supposed to do? How do you want to be cared for? Do you want everything done? Do you want only some things done? And the thing is, your directives will change as you age. My directive right now is keep me alive, okay? In a few years, it might not be. It might be send me on my way. I'm ready to go home. But the reality is, you need something. You got to tell people what you want. And that's the whole sense of pre-planning. The other thing is, and I love this part, when somebody dies and everything has to happen at once, how well are you thinking? And you're not. I've heard of people where somebody dies and the next thing they're spending $35,000 on a funeral. Because they got to do this and 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 all of a sudden a whole bunch of money is being spent on a funeral, and the deceased is looking down from heaven going, what are you thinking? Sometimes it's sort of having that plan saves your family a lot of money too. It can be very helpful. The other thing that goes with the pre-planning, okay, is let your family know about the sacrament of the sick. Do you know how many people don't get the sacrament of the sick because the family waits until the absolute last minute to phone the priest? 3 times since being here in the city, I've gotten a phone call saying, my mom has passed away, can you come and anoint her? Well, no, I can come and pray for her, but I can't anoint her because she's dead. We don't anoint the dead. We pray for them, we pray over them, we anoint the living. And the thing is, the sacrament of the sick does not have to be done as they are breathing their last breath. The sacrament of the sick should be as soon as they go in the hospital. Father Francis has run into it where people have refused the sacrament of the sick because I'm not dying yet. I'm going to die, but I'm not dying yet. Come back in a week, And you really, really worry about those people, because what happens if you don't get to them? Because sometimes that happens. We have to plan ahead. Let your family know that you would like the sacrament of the sick. Or if you go in the hospital, ask for it yourself. Because once you've received it, Father will come back and check up on you. The other part of it is when we talk about the last sacrament, which is the greatest last sacrament to receive? The Eucharist. The Eucharist. Bread for the journey. In Viaticum, confession, the Eucharist, and the anointing. But the important one is the Eucharist. Bread for the journey, to strengthen us, to prepare us, to carry us forward on the journey to eternal life. Because that's where we're all heading, right? So sometimes that's the other thing. It's like you're in the hospital. Make sure they know you're Catholic and you would like the Eucharist. We're very, very lucky here. We have people who like going to the hospital to give people the Eucharist. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. I had one lady phone me up, very, very upset because her dad passed away. And no, we hadn't anointed him because he didn't want to be anointed because he wasn't dying yet. But he had Eucharist that morning. And I'm going, well, that's not a bad deal. He received bread for the journey. That's a good thing. Sorry that we weren't able to anoint him, but we should have anointed him when he came into the hospital, not waiting for the last moment. Pardon me? Well, the statement was about anointing of the sick, sacrament of the sick. The other one is we don't call it last rites anymore, because that one has real bad vibes to it, because some people, that's, they don't want last rites because that means they're done, So yeah, sometimes the terminology changes, and the thing is it changes our understanding. And the thing is, the sacrament of the sick, the anointing of the sick is the same thing. Right? The only difference between the different ones is if I go in there and I'm anointing somebody who has got cancer, there's certain prayers for that person. If the person is in the hospital and they're dying just of old age, there's certain prayers for that. We have different prayers that we can use, right? There's also prayers when the person's death is imminent, right? Or where the person's death is not. Or they're just going into the hospital for a surgery. And the thing is, you can die from a surgery. So there's prayers before that. So part of it is also trying to get us to understand the sacrament of the sick is more than, and should be used more often than it's actually being used. The other thing that I have, and it's in a handout for you, is a faith-based directive for my health care, a statement of my Catholic values. And the thing is, as we get more and more into this pre-planning before death, and we start looking at our life before death, it's like, what are my Catholic values, and what should I be looking at prior to? Can you stop treatment? In the Catholic Church, we look at it as ordinary treatment, extraordinary treatment. Ordinary treatment can become extraordinary in certain situations. I'll give you an example. The person has been doing dialysis for 35 years. And they're ready to say enough is enough. Do they have the right to say, I want to stop treatment? Does the Catholic Church uphold that right? And yes, we do. Yes, we do. If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you have to take these blood pressure pills or you will get high blood pressure and you will die. You can go home and you have the right to pour them down the toilet or take them. That is your God-given right. Okay, it's called free will. Okay, it's also somewhat similar to stupidity at times, right? We do the dumbest things, right? But the thing is, we have the right. So if I have the right to say, no, I'm not going to take my blood pressure pills, or yes, I am going to take my blood pressure pills, when I'm in the hospital, I have the right to say, I don't want to be on a ventilator, okay? Or I don't want X, Y, and Z. right? And we have the right to say. Because the thing is, we know that this human frame here is one day going to fall apart. It's not meant to last forever. And so the thing is, it's like, what do I want done? Make sure people know. Make sure people understand what it is that you want out of life. Some people want more, okay? Some people can put up with more. Some people can deal with more. Some people can deal with less. But do we understand the differences, and have we let people know? These are important things. So I've given you a handout that explains the statement from the Catholic Church. And it's something to read over and think about when you're actually planning for these things. The other thing is, I have a number of handouts here from Martin Brothers and from Cornerstone. And they're different handouts to help you sort of look at these things. I do not expect you all to rush out and pre-plan your funerals, okay? But when you're planning your funerals, there's two sides to it. One is funeral home, one is church. They do overlap, but they're not the same kind of planning. The funeral home is going to look at the practical things, the financial things. The church is going to look at the spiritual. What are the readings? Who do you want to do what? If you're a Knights of Columbus member or a CWL member, do you want them there? Do you want some kind of honor guard? Who do you want us to let know to do something for you? So these are the kinds of pre-plannings that become very, very helpful. The funeral home is going to look at a bunch of different things that they have to do to help you navigate the law, right? You can't just take Uncle Joe and stick him in the ground. There are rules that have to be followed, right? And so we have to follow those things. But it's good to know them ahead of time instead of at the last minute have to deal with them. The other side of it is how many of you have already had to arrange a funeral? How much fun was it? How distressful was it? Very. Would it have been helpful if you'd known some of these things that I've talked about tonight beforehand? And would it have been nice if you'd had some handouts to look at to go, that's what they need. That's what would have been helpful. And that's the whole sense of the pre-planning, to look ahead of it. Because then what happens is you've done all the pre-planning, okay? So if the pre-planning is for your own funeral, right? Then you know that the people are going to do what you would like them to do. Or at least you hope that they are going to do what you would like them to do. Because once you're gone, sometimes they pull a fast one on you. I had one lady, she told me she wasn't going to have a service. I told her when she was dead, I was going to pray for her anyway. Her response was, well, Father, if you're going to have a mass for me and pray for me anyway, then I want to plan it. So we planned her funeral together, you know. Sometimes it's in the conversation that you can help people along. But the reality is, if it's your funeral that you're planning for, then let people know what it is that you want. If you're reading through the materials because you know that one of these days you're going to have to bury somebody, or there's a very, very good chance you're going to have to bury somebody, it would be nice to know what you have to do ahead of time. And so frequently when you plan your own, you get an understanding of what you might have to do for someone else. And maybe then you go to the person and say, have you ever thought of putting this together ahead of time so that the family knows? And especially if you've got a friend whose family is not going to church much anymore, you know they're going to be distressed. You know they're going to need help. Well, let's give it to them ahead of time, right? Because at that last minute, it is really, really hard.